Boker Tov, Chodesh Tov. The Gemara is assuming that in the case of Gozel, there's a psul kol shiva, all 7 days of Pesach. The Gemara finds a problem with that because L'kachtem lachem, which means ownership over the lulav, only applies on the first day. And that's what forces the Gemara to introduce the principle of mitzvah bo ba'aver. Now, there's a tosus here, be'inon, which is on Daf Chav Tes Amid Beis. And he writes, Mashma de pshitole de be'inon hadar bekuli yoma. Now, the Gemara says the following. I understand why Yavesh is Pasal Kol Shiva, because the Torah says hadar, although the word hadar appears describing and defining the esrog, but we equate all daled minim with the esrog, and they all 4 minim require hadar. And the psul of hadar applies all 7 days. Lochem, on the other hand, requiring ownership over the daled minim, only applies to the first day. And if you fast forward a minute to the third line of Tosas, he writes, V'tema, Maishna zeh mizeh. What's the difference between ownership over the daled minim, u'lekachtem lachem, as opposed to hadar? In the case of lekachtem lachem, we assume that's a requirement only in the first day, whereas in the case of hadar, we establish that that's a requirement in all 7 days. And then we fast forward to Lachach Nira, which is 3 lines up before the end of Tosfos. Tahainu Taimu Dishum Diyom Rishon Doraisa Bigvulin. The first day of the 7 days of Sukkot, the 4 minim are Doraisa. Anywhere on the face of the earth. Shar Yomim, the balance, the other 6 days, are D'Rabbanan, Seichel and Migdash. Hilkach be'inon halakicha kimodalid minim ulekicha kol echad v'echad tikun b'shar yomi ke'ein doraisa. He says that as far as the dalid minim themselves are concerned, then once the Rabbanon instituted an obligation to take the daled minim for the entire balance of Sukkot, they required that you take the daled minim that you would have taken on the first day. And that's called ke'ein da'oraisa. And therefore, just like on a doraisa level, you require that each one take his own daled minim, and that they all be hadar. Those requirements apply kol shiva, al chaser v'sha'ul lo tikun. When the Rabbanan instituted the takana of lulav kol shiva, they didn't exclude a case of shol where you borrowed the daled minim and it's not yours. And with regard to gozel, we have an additional problem of mitzvah bo ba'aver. Now, he doesn't discuss at great length why chaser is kasher kol shiva. I guess that's something that we'll have to get to much later on. But we understand his distinction between the lulav on the first day on the rest of the days. Number one, in the fact that on the first day lulav is doraisa, and the rest of the days it's only D'Rabbanan Zeichel and Migdash. And the difference being that with regard to Lokachtem Lachem, the requirement of ownership, that's not a definition of the daled minim. That's something extraneous to the daled minim, that you have to own them. And that applies only on the first day. The Rabbanan never established the requirement of lachem with regard to the balance of sukkahs. But when we're talking about hadar, like Yavesh is a psul of hadar, that defines the nature of the daled minim, of the object itself. Okay, so that's as far as Tosfos are concerned. Now, the Ramban has a different explanation, which he has here in the middle of footnote Samach Aleph, if you happen to have the Masechet. If not, I'll just read it to you, Baal Peh. And he quotes the Ramban as saying that at the Zman of the Beis HaMikdash, Lulav was taken in the Mikdash all 7 days, whereas outside the Mikdash, only on the first day. And that's what was the original situation. After the Churban Beis HaMikdash, then Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai instituted an obligation of taking the lulav all 7 days anywhere on the face of the earth. The Mishnah, says the Ramban, is addressing the laws of lulav at the time that the Mikdash stood, when the mitzvah was to take the lulav all 7 days. The Mishnah is not dealing with the mitzvah of lulav on a D'Rabbanan level from the time of Takanas Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai and beyond. So whatever disqualifications that are listed in the Mishnah, they apply to the mitzvah of lulav min Torah. The Mishnah is not dealing at all with psulim on a D'Rabbanan level, because we're addressing a historical period before the Takana of Rav Yochanan ben Zakkai. And now we can understand the Gemara's point that the Mishnah makes no distinction between the din of lulav on the first day as opposed to the din of lulav on the other days of Chag HaSukkos. And therefore we understand that lulav hayavesh would be possible in the Beis HaMikdash all 7 days, because we need hadar for all the daled minim. So, for example, even though it says pre-eitz hadar with regard to esrog, and esrog requires hadar, and that applies all 7 days in the Beis HaMikdash, so too lulav requires hadar, and yavesh is possible for all 7 days. But now we get to the psul of Gazel. Why should Gazel be possible in the Beis HaMikdash for the entire holiday of Sukkot? Meaning, on a Doraisa level, there's a fundamental difference between the lulav on the first day, where the Torah says L'kachtem lachem, and the mitzvah of Mikdash, which applies during the balance of Sukkot. There the Torah says, not L'kachtem lachem, but Usmachtem lifnei Hashem Elokechem shivas yomim. And the Chazal understood that the word simcha means simcha together with the daled minim. And the daled minim are not required to be yours, because the Torah here says usmachtem. It doesn't say L'kachtem lachem like it does on the first day. So when we go back to the mitzvah d'oraisa, which the Mishnah is addressing at the time the Mikdash stood, then we have two fundamentally different mitzvahs. We have the mitzvah on the first day, was L'kachtem lachem, and the mitzvah that applies to the balance of the 7 days, usmachtem lifnei Hashem. In both cases, we have to take the daled minim. But in the first case of L'kachtem lachem, we are required to own the daled minim, because the Torah went out of its way and said lachem. But with regard to the other 6 days in the Beis HaMikdash, which is the mitzvah d'oraisa of usmachtem, the Torah doesn't mention or stipulate that it's got to be lachem, and therefore the Gemara is bothered. Why did the Mishnah write lulav hagazel v'yavesh pasul, which means that just like yavesh is pasul called shiva, because it doesn't have hadar, lulav should be pasul called shiva, but we don't know why. And that's where the Gemara is forced to introduce the principle of mitzvah baba vera. Okay. So that's as far as the Ramban is concerned. Now, the concept of mitzvah b'avera has to be kind of defined in a very limited way. What do I mean? You can have situations where there was an avera done on this object. Let's say, for example, the Mishnah mentions lulav shel ashera or shel irani dachas. So we're talking about a case of a lulav that was taken from a tree that was worshipped. And there was an avera done vis-a-vis that tree and the lulav that's on the tree. Now, we're going to see later on that the psul of lulav shel asherah has nothing to do with mitzvah b'avera. And the question is, why not? Once you say that gazel is mitzvah b'avera, then asherah should also be mitzvah b'avera. And the answer is, and this is given by many Rishonim, that mitzvah b'avera only applies in the following cases that are defined by this formulation. Al yidei ha-mitzvah ba'hav, I'm sorry, start again. Al yidei ha-avera ba'ha-mitzvah. Which means that it would have been impossible to fulfill that mitzvah without doing the avera. The avera sets up the mitzvah. Now, in the case of a lulav shel asherah, the fact that this asherah tree was worshipped as avodah zarah is totally irrelevant to the mitzvah that I want to fulfill with this lulav. It's not that, well, because you worship the asherah, therefore you have access to this lulav. You would have equal access to the lulav even without having done the avera. That's not mitzvah b'avera. In the case of gazel, where you need to acquire the lulav, you had no lulav in your possession, you had to steal it from someone else. The gzela is the machshir, the act of the avera of gzela facilitates the ability to have access to the lulav and to implement the mitzvah. So therefore, the mitzvah is ba'a machmas avera. So mitzvah ba'a ba'avera means mitzvah ba'a machmas avera. And therefore, if you take a look for a moment on Taf Lamed, the first footnote, and you put your finger down in this footnote to about the 8th line, it says L'dasa Ritva, mitzvah ba'ba bera psula is only im kain mitzvah mesayeh lavras avera. Kagon Khan, that he gets access to the lulav through the avera of gzela. But in the case of an asherah tree, lulav shel asherah, okay, that's an avera of avodah zarah that was done on the tree, vis-a-vis the tree. But the mitzvah of netila eino ba machmas avera. It's not that because you worship the tree, therefore you can now have access to the mitzvah of lulav. And therefore, ein leposlo mitam mitzvah b'avera. But then we get to the case, which is a lot more complicated, and that's called matzah shel teva. Now, Tosfos, Dibra Maskel Mishum, which is the long Tos at the top of page Lamed Amud Aleph, is going to bring up the issue of matzah shel tevel. You'll see it towards the end of Tosfos if you count upwards. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Umiu tema. He says that the Gemara in Psachim excludes a matzah shel tevel. So what's a matzah shel tevel? Obviously, we know what that means. There was tvua, grains that were cut down. He converted those grains into flour, and then he made matzah out of it, but he was never mashrish trumas and masos. Now, you're not allowed to eat that because it's tevel. But the Gemara says that the reason why we cannot fulfill our mitzvah of matzah with the matzah shel tevel is because of an equation between matzah and chametz. And the matzah, like the chametz, is only prohibited on the one iser, the iser chametz. But if there's another additional prohibition, in this case tevel, then it doesn't meet the standards of matzah. So Tosfos wants to know, why does the Gemara have to go through this entire complex logic? Why doesn't the Gemara just say typically mishum de mitzvah b'avera? It's just simply a case of mitzvah b'avera. Now, the simple answer to this question seems to be that we just define mitzvah b'avera means mitzvah haba machmas avera. And why is this case of matzah's tevel a case of mitzvah ba machmas havera? Tosfos wants to apply mitzvah ba havera to undermine the possibility of using this matzah shel tevel for the mitzvah of matzah. The disqualification, says Tosfos, should be because of the avera of tevel. Madua Einzu mitzvah baba ver. That's Tosfos' problem. Now, according to the Ritva, that we said that the mitzvah baba vera means that al yidei ha-vera ba mitzvah, so that the avera of tevel has nothing to do with the mitzvah of achilas matzah. Right? It's not that, well, because of the avera, like in the case of Gezel, that's why it sets up the mitzvah. No. This matzah could have been used for the mitzvah of matzah, even if he was mafresh shumas, and it wasn't tevel. See, you can't say that the iser achilas tevel is what sets up the mitzvah of achilas matzah. So in the case of Gezel, it's because of the mitzvah that he did this avera, because the avera was necessary in order to accomplish the mitzvah. But you can't say that the avera of achilas tevel was a result of the fact that he needs a mitzvah of matzah, and that through achilas tevel and that avera, therefore he gets a mitzvah of matzah. And the conclusion, therefore, is that according to the Ritva, Tosfos kasha is no kasha, because matzah shel tevel would not be possible midin mitzvah baba avera. Now, Tosfos asks a kasha about matzah shel tevel. Apparently, Tosfos has a slightly different understanding of mitzvah baba avera, if he wants to subsume matzah shel tevel on the mitzvah baba avera. But in fact, even if we leave Tosfos on the side, we have another shita, and that's the Rambam shita in Pirush HaMishnayos, that lulav shel ashera in our Mishnah is possible because of mitzvah baba avera. That certainly is not like the Ritva, because there's no way, no how that you could say that the avera of avodah zarah is what facilitates the mitzvah of lulav. And yet the Rambam applies the principle of mitzvah baba avera to disqualify a lulav shel ashera. And the Magid Mishnah in Perek Ches Mehilchas Lulav HaGazel says that he had a different girsa in the Gemara. So that's a sugya later on in Daf Lamed Aleph. So it seems that the Rambam, based on his girsa, understood that mitzvah baba avera applies whenever there was an avera done to this object which you now want to use for a mitzvah. Like, for example, you worship the Asherah. Now, if he eats a matzah shel tevel, then that chefta of tevel is a chefza d'avera, meaning if he wants to eat it for matzah, he's going to have to violate the iser of achilas teva. So whenever the mitzvah entails a violation of an avera, because this chefza, this object, in this case a lulav, generates an avera. Now, in the case of avodah zarah or asherah, he's aser bano. You're not allowed to have any benefit from the asherah. So that now, when he does the mitzvah and he benefits from the asherah, it's clear that the asherah is a chefza shel avera. And here also, in the case of tevel, where he has to eat the tevel to fulfill his mitzvah matzah, he's got a chefza of avera. So we have now two definitions of mitzvah bob avera. We've got the Ritva, and the Ritva says that machmas havera ba ha-mitzvah, meaning without the avera you could not possibly fulfill the mitzvah. And now we have another broader definition of mitzvah bob avera. Any situation in which the avera was done to the object, then there's no fulfillment of the mitzvah. So whether it means the achilas tevel is the avera, so the avera is done through the object of tevel, or it means a lulav shel asherah where the asherah is worshipped as avodah zarah, in all those cases, it's mitzvah bob avera. And that seems to be the shita of the Rambam, and possibly the shita of Tosfos as well. Okay. Now the Gemara says the following. We derive mitzvah bob avera from a pasuk in Malachi that's referring to karbonos. And he's got a stolen animal, or alternatively, an animal that has the status of a treifa or a balmum. And both of those categories are excluded from the Mizbeach. But because those two categories are mentioned in one breath by Malachi, therefore we have an equation between the two. And what does the Gemara derive from that equation? That just like if the animal, let's say, broke its leg, and therefore it's a balmum, it'll always remain a balmum. That's called ein lo takana. So too in the case of a stolen animal, ein lo takana. It's always possible in Mizbeach. Now, what's the chiddush? That loshna lifnei yeush, loshna liachar yeush. Right. So this you'll see the Gemara that we read yesterday on the top of Daf Lam. Now, what's yeush? Yeush, you'll see here number vav on the bottom. Shamanu es habaylim shenisyashu kigon diomar vayli lechisaron kis. The Baal gave up all hope of ever retrieving his object. You know, they put up all the signs, wanted, dead or alive, and they couldn't find him. They're not going to locate the Ganav, and he gave up hope. He despaired from ever retrieving his stolen, in this case, stolen lulav, or stolen animal, I should say. Now, the Gemara tells us that this behema that was stolen is disqualified for the Mizbeach. And it matters not whether or not the Bailim were Messiahish or not Messiahish. Now, this pasuk is teaching me mitzvah bob avera, the psul of Gazel. But l'chora, in a case of Gzela, there's another reason why he can't bring the behema on the Mizbeach, irrelevant to mitzvah bob avera, and that's the pasuk ish ki yagdish es beso, and the Gemara Bava Kama Samaches derives from that pasuk that davar shalo ki beso yochel hagdish, ve'eno yochel hagdish davar shehu shel chamfer. So what does that mean? You need ownership over the animal in order to be magdish the animal and designated for the mizbeach. You have to own the animal. Now, if you stole the animal, let's say it's before Yeush, then you can't be magdish that animal. It's not yours. You don't have bailus. It's not ishki yagdish es besa. You can only be magdish something that's yours. So he writes here, V'im Kain. This is line 4 in footnote number Zion. Ein tzarich l'joshas mikem shebehema gzula shekdisha hagazlon kodem yeyish b'al psula krova. In other words, I don't need any drasha to teach me that if he stole an animal and he was magdish it, he can't bring it on the mizbeach. I'll tell you why he can't bring it on the mizbeach. Because he wasn't able to be magdish the behemoth. He stole an animal, he was magdish behemoth, but the Torah says, ish ki yagdish es beso. He can only be magdish his own bayis or his own behemoth. So therefore, the hagdasha would not be chal, would not take effect, and the animal is not hegdesh, and he won't be able to bring it on the mizbeach because it's not hegdesh. You can't bring chulin into the azor. So again, just to read the line that's most relevant to our discussion here, you see the line that starts with bishlema. Let's count down here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. At the end of the 5th line of the Gemara on Daf Lamed, it says bishlema lifnei yeush. I understand why the animal cannot be brought on the mizbeach if it was stolen, and yeush did not take effect yet, take place yet. Adam ki yakrav mikem, Omar Achmona. The Torah says the carbon has to come mikem, and lavdi deu. If it's stolen, it's not mikem, it's not yours. That's before yeush. So we know from the word mikem that the gazlan can't be magdish the behema because it's not his. Now, I don't need the word mikem for that, although the Gemara seems to say Adam ki yakrav michem Omar Achmona, but we have another pasuk, ish ki yagdish as beso, that he can only be magdish that which he owns. So the Gemara, in this case of a stolen animal that the Gazlan was magdish before Yeush, the Gemara derives it from the psul from Mikem, is l'chora ain't sarach l'joshas Mikem. We don't need the Joshua Mikem because there was no bailus over the animal before Yeush when the Gazlan stole it, and therefore it's not Beisel. And the Hegdesh is not Chal. So this is the subject of the second Tosas on this page, the Tosas Dibra Masel Ki. And he says the following, that if we only had the word beso, and we derive from beso that the Gazlan cannot be magdish the behema before Yeush because it's not his, then we could derive from the pasuk mikem that the Gazlan could not be makriv a behema gzula before Yeush Bailit. What does that mean? So I think what Tosas is saying is that in order to derive two conclusions, you need two psukim. If you didn't have the word beso and you only had michem, then from michem you would say that the Gazlan cannot be makriv the behema before Yeush. You follow? We need, if not for the word beso, then we would need the word michem to teach me that if it's gzula and there was no yeush, then he can't bring the carbon. But now that we have the word beso, michem is going to become free. Why? Because from beso we're already going to derive the conclusion that there was never akdosh at all. The Hegdesh couldn't be Chal because it was Gzela before Yeush, and it's not Beso. Now that we have already a derivation that there's no Hegdesh at all, what do we do with the word Mikem? So in order to understand what we do with the word Mikem, we quote a Gemara in Chulin that has a different derivation, a different halacha that's derived from the pasuk Michem. So again, just to summarize this whole discussion that we just had, why does the Gemara say that Ish ki yachar Michem Amar Achmana, and before Yesh the psul is Michem, when we have a pasuk of Ish ki yakdish as beso, from which the Gemara Bava Kama derives that you can only be magdish that which is yours. And yet our Gemara is operating from the word mikem. So Tosas points out that if we didn't have beso and we only had mikem, then enochinami we could derive the conclusion as our Gemara presents it, that you can only be makar a carbon that's yours and not a stolen carbon, which means gzela before yesh. But we still need, as the Gemara derives in Bava Kama, the word beso, to tell me that you cannot be magdish an animal that's not yours because it's not beso. And then at that point, we turn back to Mikem and we say, so why do we need the drush of Mikem? And here Tosfos quotes a Gemara in Chulin that derives an entirely different halacha from Mikem. So it's almost as if our Gemara is operating without the pasuk beso, but at the end of the day, we need both beso and Mikem, which means that you have to own the animal. If you don't own the animal, you can't be makriv as a korban, and therefore, if it's gzela before yeush, then certainly I understand very well you can't be makriv as a korban. But what about the case of liachar yeush? If the problem is it's not your korban, then once the bailim or misyayish, then it becomes yours. And if it becomes yours, you should be able to use it on the mizbeach. So we're really in a bind when we try to understand that from this pasuk in Malachi, we're going to exclude Gazul. Why do I need that for? Well, what would be the havamina that he could bring a Gazul when the Torah says lachem michem, it's got to be yours? Well, the answer is, what about after Yerush? If we only had the pasuk Mikem, then after Yesh it's yours. You required ownership. The Gazan should be able to bring this behem on the mizbeach, and that's where the pasuk in Malachi comes up to teach us the equation to Piseach, that even after Yerush, you cannot use this behema on the mizbeach, and that's the psul of mitzvah bab avera. Which again, just to review, according to the Ritva, means that ha mitzvah ba machmas avera, and that's this case of Gaza. Now, the Gemara says explicitly here, eloli achar yesh. So the Gemara asks, hakanya b'yesh, and that forces the Gemara to introduce mitzvah ba avera. But you see clearly that the Gazlan requires ownership over the stolen animal when there's Yesh Bal. However, there is a machlokes in the Gemara in Bava Kama Daf Samach Vav as to whether or not Yesh is Kona. Now, I'm not sure. The Gemara in Bava Kama quotes Rav, Reish Lakish, and Rabbah, and they hold that Yerush B'chti Kadi, as long as the Nigzal was Misyayish, then the Gazan acquires ownership over the Chayfetz HaGazan. So our Rabbi Yochanan here, because keep in mind, if you look at the last line on the previous Amud, all of this is Rabbi Yochanan. And Rabbi Yochanan holds like one opinion in Bava Kama, that all you need is Yerush, and the Gazlan acquires ownership over the Gzeil. So that apparently is the Shita of Rav Yosef. So if you're looking at footnote number ches, and you count down 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 7 lines down, you'll see that he writes Das Rabbi Yochanan ki Rabbi Yosef. Oh, wait, 1 second. I got the names mixed up. On the second line, he says, Muchach mikan shesover kedas Rav Reish Lakish v'Rava. That's against Rav Yosef. They hold that all you need is Yesh Bailim, and then the Gazlan acquires ownership over the object. Then we have a dissenting view of Rav Yosef in the same Sugya Baba Kama Samach Vov. Eina Gazlan Kone Es HaChefetz HaGozul Al Yidei Yesh HaNigzal Bilvad. Yesh HaNigzal is not sufficient to clinch the ownership of the Gazlan over the object. Now it seems that Rabbi Yochanan actually accepted the opinion of Rav Yosef, which makes this Gemara that we're learning now very difficult, because Rav Yosef is of the opinion that the Gazlan does not have a kinyan and acquire ownership based on Yush alone. And yet Rav Yochanan here, who presumably accepted Rav Yosef over there, Bava Kama, he says, Hakanya b'yesh. So one answer is that Rabbi Yochanan here in our sugya is quoting Rav Shimon Bar Yochai. He himself holds that you cannot acquire ownership over the gzela with yesh. That's not sufficient. But Rav Shimon Bar Yochai holds that you can acquire ownership of the gzela with yesh alone, like the Shita of Rav Yosef. So that's one approach, to say that again, Rabbi Yochanan here, basing himself on Rav Shimon Bar Yochai, reflects the Shita of Yosef that Yesh alone is enough for the Gazlan to acquire ownership. Tosfos offers a different approach, and that is that when it says here Hakanya b'Yeush in Rabbi Yochanan, that's after what's called Shini Hashem. Because Kodem Shekdisha Hoisa Chulin, V'achar Shekdisha Hegdesh. So now we have a combination of two elements. We have Yeush and we have Shini Hashem. Why? Because Meikara was Chulin V'hashta Hegdesh. So even if I hold that Yesh alone is not sufficient for the Gazlan to acquire ownership, but nevertheless, if there's Yesh and Shini Hashem together, those two forces join into one powerful force, and they generate a kinyan, such that the Gazlan is Kona with Yesh and Shini Hashem. So therefore, what is the point of Malachi excluding Gozel, Lemizbeach? After all, once it was Yeush, then the Gazlan was Kona. But the answer is Mitzvah Baba Avir. But now we're going to equate lulav hagazul with a behema gzula of hegdish. And in footnote number 10, here Yud, he writes, V'afsha posuk hamalam deinu l'psul mitzvah baveros karbanos. Maybe this is a separate halacha, karbanos. You bring a carbon lifnei Hashem, and this is a stolen object. The Torah excludes that. No, hu adin l'chol mitzvah baveros. The Torah disqualifies any mitzvah bavera beyond the restricted realm of karbanos. So, for example, the Gemara Bava Kama on Daf Tzadi Daled establishes that if he steals wheat and he grinds up the wheat and then he adds water and he does lisha, right, kneading, and then he bakes the bread, the Gemara says that the bracha that he makes on this hafrashas challah is called niyut. It's like he's blaspheming. Mishum shehi mitzvah baba ver. Now we're not dealing with karbanos here; we're dealing with challah. So you see that mitzvah baba ver does not apply restricted to karbanos and only karbanos, but applies to other mitzvahs as well. So it applies to challah, then it should apply to lulav. And that's called mitzvah baba ver. Okay. Now, the Gemara of the Amar Rabbi Yochanan, right? That's about 10 lines down from the top. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 lines down from the top. The Amar Rabbi Yochanan Gemara is going to offer an alternative source from which we derive the psul of mitzvah baba vera. And the question that the Mefarshim are going to raise is, why is Gemara working overtime to find an alternative source for mitzvah baba vera? So the Aruch LaNer postulates that there are two types of mitzvahs. And on one category you have korban, and on the other category you have lulav. And we would have said that the psul of gazul applies to korban just 1 second. I'm in footnote number 12 now, Yud Beis. Vayamakom lomar shelo yipasal ad gazul sharehu kul Hashem. What does he mean by that? Oh, I see what he's saying. in the karbonos, right, there are four types of karbonos. So let's leave out Ola. We'll focus on Shlomim, Chatas, and Osham. In karbonos, the carbon is split. Part of it goes Lashem, and it's burnt on the Mizbeach, and part is Lachem. You enjoy the benefit, whether it's the Zichrei Kuhuna in the case of Chatos or Osham, or even the Bailamit, the Basar, the carbon in the case of Shlomim. So the element of Hanav benefiting from the carbon is built into the mitzvah. As opposed to Lulav, take the Lulav, but that's not what you call Hana. What Hana do you get from shaking a Lulav? So the Havamina now is that if you're benefiting from the mitzvah, like in the case of carbon, then the Torah says don't get any benefit from a mitzvah if that mitzvah was set up on an Aveira. But if the mitzvah is Kulul Hashem, like Lulav, then we would think that there's no psul of mitzvah baba Aveira. So for that, we need another source to break ground and add a different category to the psul of mitzvah baba Aveira, even when it's Kulul Hashem and there's no benefit that you get from the mitzvah, no hano. The Omer Rabbi Yochanan Bishum Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai Ma'idech Siv Pasuk in Yeshaya Ki Ani Hashem Ohev Mishpat Sonei Gazel Bi Ola. So what's going on here? The Torah in Yeshayahu Hanavi is saying something about Ola, as if to say that in the case of a carbon Ola, HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, I despise a stolen Ola. Well, why are you focusing on Ola? So at this point, we could say that maybe Ola is Kula Kalil, and therefore there's no Hana that you benefit from it, and it's like Lulav, and that's why we need the second category of Mitzvah Baba Feir. Mashal Melech Basar V'Dam, Shahaya over al Beis HaMeches, Amar Lavadav Tnu Meches Lamochsin. This is what's called cheating on taxes. That's what really this Gemara is about. So the Melech tells his Avodim that they should pay the Meches, even though they're working on behalf of the king. And when you collect the taxes, the tax collectors are also operating on behalf of the king. So why is he instructing his Avodim, make sure that you pay the Meches? Doesn't make any sense, because the money and the tax are going to the Melech in any event. So why pay the Meches? Like going from one hand to the other. I mean, it all belongs to you. That's what the tax collectors are going to say to the Almighty. I'm sorry, to the Melech. I'm already skipping to the Nimshal. Amalahem. So the Melech says, you know why I want you to be careful about paying the Meches? That if the officers of the king are paying the Meches, then everyone should learn with the Kal Vachomer that they all have to pay the Meches. They shouldn't avoid paying the taxes. What's it called? Tax aversion. Is Afa Kodesh Baruch. Now we get to the Nimshal. HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, Ani Hashem sonei gazel bi'olah. A stolen olah I find repulsive. Many Yilmu Banai, and let Klal Yisrael derive from me, says the Ribono Shel Olam, that the Avrichu Atzman HaGezel, they should avoid Gezel. The same way that a HaKadosh Baruch Hu hates Gezel in a carbon olah, so too in all mitzvahs HaKadosh Baruch Hu hates Gezel. That's the psul of mitzvah haba be'avera. Okay, then. So let's just make a note of where we got up to. Itmar nam. Okay, so we're going to take a little bit of a break for 2 or 3 minutes, and then Belinetta will continue in Sanhedrin until 11 o'clock.